Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, we'll be digging into how the Democrats here in Kentucky over the last week or so have certainly lost their minds when it comes to understanding the Constitution. Apparently, they didn't attend civics class, or they're purposely ignoring what they've learned about the Constitution in order to justify their crazy positions. There's a few debates that went on in our legislature that certainly illustrates this. Also, we'll be digging into a question of we're spending literally tens of millions on taxpayer incentives here in Kentucky for the film industry, and we're slated to spend tens of millions more. We'll go into, is this actually a good investment? A question that it seems like nobody really wants to answer. So we'll have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before I dig down into it, please make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe.
Conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
So obviously, we're going to be digging into the stories I mentioned at the top, but I wanted to start off with some good news before I start talking about things that, might make you upset, or Democrats going crazy, or Republicans and Democrats colluding together to spend and offer tens of millions of dollars to get movies shot here in Kentucky. Before I do any of that, I want to tell you something very positive that has happened. Now, for those of you who've listened to the episode that comes out between the video episodes, we do a video episode once a week that gets aired on the radio or TV if you're listening there, and also goes out on all social media platforms. But then there's a second episode that comes out on Thursdays that is released in the podcast-only format. You can head over to theandrewshow.com if you want to go ahead and listen to those shows. However, in this last week's show, I was talking about two bills. One was House Bill 399 that deals with ruckuses being created inside the chamber. And as I laid out, it's a pretty ridiculous bill as it sits. It has severe punishments for people who protest too loudly in the Capitol, somewhere where I've held protests. You maybe have even attended protests. But essentially, in a place that's historically an area you protest, not inside the chambers, but outside on the rotunda. Right to Life just had a protest/event there. Well, they're passing a bill, and it passed out of committee, working its way through the House or Senate, that would make it to where if you protest too loudly in those areas, common areas of protest, you could find yourself being charged with a Class D felony, which means you would be 5 years in prison for the second offense. So that's 5 years in prison for protesting too loudly. And also, of course, if you organize a protest and then they get too loud there, you can also find yourself getting 5 years in prison. It's odd to, of course, come from Republicans when they've seen, when people are protesting just out in front of the Capitol building, not those who came in and did violence, of course, but those who were just protesting outside but were doing so too loudly were charged for the January 6th protest. What they're saying is those people protesting too loudly and disrupting legislative business, they believe January 6th protesters should have gotten 5 years in prison. And to put this in further perspective, there is no such law that goes on at our federal level. When somebody makes a ruckus outside or inside of the chambers of the legislature, they are removed. They are not sentenced to 5 years in prison. However, that is what the Kentucky legislature is trying to do. Now, the bill, I talked about that bad bill, and I talked about another bill that was a backdoor red flag law giving the ability to issue EPOs if you post something on social media that somebody finds offensive. Basically expanding out EPOs to not just cover physical threats, which it should, protective orders, restraining orders, but also to expand them out to include receiving EPOs for posting things online that hurts a person's feelings. And obviously this provides another avenue for red flag gun laws, of course, the ability to take away somebody's firearms without them having actually committed a crime. In this case, we're using precog based upon your words in order to figure out whether or not you're too much of a danger and take away your gun rights, and also take away and issue protective orders against you, and that was House Bill 96. So I talked about both those bills in depth. So if you don't like the quick pass over I did, you disagree with something I said, you think those sound like good bills, go back, listen to that show. I spent 15 minutes on each bill digging through them, so it'll help you perhaps better understand. But regardless, I sent out a call. We need to be calling into the legislators. On top of that, online, of course, on these two bills, we saw Savannah Maddox, Representative Maddox, post about these bills. We saw others pushing out about these bills, calling on these bills, saying these are some bad bills. Well, I have an update for you on those bills. And this is why it's important for you to be communicating with your legislator. First, let's go to House Bill 399. There has been several floor amendments now filed to that bill. So hopefully, when it gets called forward and those amendments are put forward, people will vote on them and pass them. And what that does is it lowers the punishments for doing so, and it limits the scope to really just being inside either a committee room or a Senate chamber or a House chamber, because obviously you do have to deal with the heckler's veto and removing somebody. They can currently remove people from, of course, those places, but they want to attach a larger punishment to it. At least this backs it down to where it's not as bad. Still worse than what we're doing at the federal level, but it does make it better. So that says that your calls are working. Let's keep hammering 399 though, making sure they really don't need that bill at all, in my opinion. Like I said, go back, listen to my show on that to learn about that. But then we have House Bill 96, the backdoor red flag law. And since you all have been calling on that and people have been getting active on that, now 6 co-sponsors have removed themselves as parts of the bill. That's Representatives Dotson, Freeland, Wilson, Grossell, Lockett, and White have all removed themselves from sponsoring that bill after they were inundated with calls and emails pointing out the problems with that piece of legislation. I can tell you this much. This legislation passed committee. It is almost unheard of that a piece of legislation will pass committee and then lose co-sponsors. It's very possible that this bill is dead, of course, but in order to make sure it's dead, make sure you're calling 1-800-372-7181. Once again, that's 1-800-372-7181, asking to leave a message for your representative. But as I was posting about that, pushing that out there, talking about people removing themselves off the bill, I saw a few comments from individuals saying, hey, look, why'd they ever sponsor the bill in the first place? Are they sponsoring things without reading it, et cetera, et cetera? And while I understand that pushback, one thing I do want to caution against is any time that someone is willing to admit that they've made mistakes. We all have made mistakes before, individuals. When somebody's willing to admit they made a mistake and fix it. Now, I don't want to hammer them too much because that creates an incentive structure, of course, to when you make a mistake to stick to your guns instead of saying, you know what, I kind of screwed up on this. Let's give them some grace on that. But here's the other thing as well that I think is incredibly important for people to understand. Our legislators have 0 support staff. They literally have a assistant that they share with 4 or 5 other legislators, and that's it. Now, of course, leadership in the Senate and House have support staff. The president and the speaker have support staff, but they do not. They kind of share a pool. They have a administrative staff, and then they have LRC bill writers. And so if they want to get a bill drafted, they can ask them to write it. But they don't have anybody reading through the legislation and telling them what fully is in it. What is the full ramifications of these bills? And so what ends up happening is either lobbyists or other House reps will come to them and say, here's what I want to do. Here's some sob story about why we need this bill. Will you co-sponsor this for me? And based on the information they give and you read through it, and if you aren't well-versed, because understand, not just sponsoring a piece of legislation too, is, well, you could read it and not understand exactly what's in it. You can read through a bill that's pages long. I mean, these bills can be 10, 20, 30 pages long. And if you don't practice law on that or work in that or something else, it's hard for you sometimes to understand exactly what it does. And so they trust the wrong people, and then they go ahead and end up putting forward bad legislation. But that's why you, the people reaching out to them and talking to them, is so incredibly important, because if we're not informing them, if we're not telling them how we feel about a piece of legislation, it's only the people who want it passed that are giving them the information. And of course, they're going to tell them whatever they need to get it done. Well, coming up after this, we'll be digging into just how the Democrats went crazy in the Senate this past week. We'll have that after this short break. And you're back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So this past week, Senate Bill 60 went through committee, made it through the Senate and over to the House. and it deals with protecting religious liberties. Now, of course, anytime you talk about protecting the rights that Democrats have a hard time with, they disagree with. Right now we see Democrats, of course, struggling with the idea that a person can have a sincerely held religious belief that somehow disagrees with their worldview. In fact, they've even gone as far as to try to reinvent what being a Christian means, what Christians are supposed to believe, what a sin is and what a sin isn't, ignoring entire parts of Scripture, of the Bible, in order to fit it to their worldviews, because they want to redefine the religion, because if they're able to redefine what religious exemptions people are able to get. That's part of the game here. But anyways, playing to that, Senate Bill 60 comes out, and what it deals with is it's establishing some cause of action of getting your attorney's fees covered, and also individual personal cause of actions if somebody violates your religious liberties and goes across RFRA. In fact, RFRA, for those of you unaware, RFRA, establishes rights beyond those protections afforded by the Constitution's Free Exercise Clause by creating a heightened standard of review for government actions that substantially burden a person's exercise of religion. So essentially, they're laws aimed around protecting a person's religious freedom. To understand that if the government's going to do something and it violates somebody's religious beliefs, they have to show really, really strong cause on how somehow it's very, very important. An example of this would be somebody wearing, a headscarf if they're in prison or something, and a hijab, let's say, if they're Muslim or something like that. Now, you may not like a religion, you may agree with something they do or don't what they do, but regardless, it is a woman's religious right to wear a hijab if that's what her religion calls for her to do, specifically in front of men. And the case we're talking about here, this case that they use in an example so often with this, deals with a woman who was in prison, wanted to wear her hijab, went around male guards and male processors, and rather than either just, if you need to get her picture for processing, if you're bringing somebody into jail for processing, and you need to get her picture, you can have her remove her hijab, but she requested that only women be present when doing so, because they're supposed to, of course, show modesty around men, including covering their head. And they refused to do that, and so she was able to sue based upon, or wanted to sue based upon this violation of religious rights. But it goes into now the lawyer fees side of things. And that's what this bill, Senate Bill 60, really is focused on. Because normally when the government violates my rights, your rights, and so you sue the government for the violation, they have caused you injury, they've caused you to need to go out and hire an attorney in order to go ahead and pursue the redress of those grievances. But if they are found guilty to have caused those damages to the government, they have to pay for your lawyer fees, because, of course, they can't also incur financial damages upon you for violating your constitutional rights. And so Senate Bill 60 expands that out and also removes some governmental immunity when it comes to individuals violating religious rights, certainly maliciously, as government officials have been seen to do so, such as, for example, Beshear, when he shut down churches and was harassing people using KSP when they went to church on Easter Sunday during COVID. He could do those things because he wasn't worried about having himself to pay out of pocket, because he could claim he was just doing his duty in office. And if he was sued, and he was, and found that he can't be doing that, well, it was on the taxpayer to pay the damages, on the taxpayer to pay for the lawyer fees. Beshear himself was not damaged. And so it gives a lot of ability for these people to act crazy and do things as long as they can come up with some reason why they should be afforded immunity from individual being held accountable as an individual basis, instead of just the government being held accountable in general for their actions. And so this also expands that out in order to add another level of you really double thinking before you violate somebody's constitutional rights as a government officer, employee, elected person. So I think what's best to help really sum up this bill too is if we go ahead and listen to what the bill's sponsor, Senator Rawlings, had to say about it on the floor when this was up for debate. Let's go ahead and take a listen to that.
What Senate Bill 60 does is ensure that when the government oversteps, citizens have the ability to recover legal costs when defending their rights, just as they would in other civil rights cases. The bill reinforces the fundamental truth that religious liberty is a core American value. If the government imposes a substantial burden on someone's sincere religious beliefs, it should bear the burden of proving a compelling interest and using the least restrictive means. That has always been the standard. What Senate Bill 60 does is ensure that when the government oversteps, citizens have the ability to recover costs and recover legal costs when defending their rights, just as they would in other civil cases, civil rights cases. This is not controversial, this is fairness. The right to free exercise of religion should not come at the cost of financial ruin for those forced to defend it in court.
Now, to further back up that explanation, I'm going to go ahead and read to you from the bill as well, what the bill does. I like to read bills directly to you, so bear with me here. Except as provided in subsection 4 of this section, a person whose religious exercise has been substantially burdened in violation of this section may assert that violation as a claim or defense in a judicial or administrative proceeding and obtain appropriate relief, which shall include costs and attorney fees. This statute, this is now subsection 4, this statute applies to all government action, whether adopted before or after the effective date of this act. State laws enacted after the effective date of this act are subject to this section unless this statute is explicitly excluded. This section shall not be construed to authorize any government action to burden any religious belief, section 5 now, if any provisions of this section or its application to any person or circumstance is held invalid, the invalidity shall not affect other provisions or applications of the section that can be given effect without the invalid provision or application, and to this end, the provisions of this section are severable. And this is 6. Exclusively for the purposes of this section, sovereign and governmental immunity are waived. Simple, straightforward, protecting religious freedoms, protecting constitutional rights. So how did the Democrats respond to this? Well, I think first we'll go ahead and go to cut 2. This is Cinder Heron out of Louisville. She's actually proposed an amendment to the bill. Let's go ahead and take a listen to what she had to say.
Senate Floor Amendment 1 will protect civil rights laws in the Kentucky cities and counties that have enacted those protections. It will shield our Commonwealth from the most costly legal attacks from outside groups and make certain that religious freedoms are balanced with civil rights.
So what she's talking about here is about the fairness ordinances that have been adopted by cities. Basically, they want to make sexual orientation and gender identity a protected class. Now, I think we need to pause here for a second because I think this is a great example of how settled, quote-unquote, science then bleeds over into law and policy and restricting people's freedoms. In this case, we're talking about the settled science that, if you're gay or transgender or queer or whatever it is that you're labeling yourself as, you were born that way, that this is an immutable characteristic. And it's important that they want you to think of those things as immutable characteristics, because if they can establish that, now the protections that are afforded to, such as people with, minorities or white people too, but protections afforded to people based on skin color, disability, those kinds of things you don't have control over, your immutable characteristics. Well, if they can classify it as the same, then they can make arguments that's protected by civil rights laws. However, if it's held that they are not the same thing, if these are choices you are making, well, then discrimination based on your personal choices is obviously allowed. I mean, we do have a constitutional right to association, to associate with who we choose to, of course. And so therefore, they need you to believe that this is settled science, that this is not a choice. Now, regardless of the fact that they argue against the settled science themselves when they make quotes that, gender's on a spectrum and that, it's about what a person's feel. A woman is a person who identifies as a woman. So you're not born a woman, you identify as a woman. That's how you feel. A person can feel, they can be gender fluid, they can feel this way or that way or what have you. All those things, the claim that they're immutable, that they're not a decision, kind of flies in the face of when you can wake up and decide you're a woman that day and then wake up and decide you're a man. But regardless, they want to imply those immutable characteristics. Now, of course, even with those types of protections, there's still things, even within civil rights, such as disability or gender, that you are allowed. For an example, if you're doing a job that requires you to be able to lift a lot of weight or climb a pole. If you're applying for a job to be a lineman, so you need to climb electric poles. Well, if you're in like a wheelchair, you obviously can't be climbing electric poles. Or if you gotta lift a lot of heavy weights and you simply can't do that due to how you were born with a smaller stature, such as a woman may be, and you just can't complete the job, they're still allowed to say, look, you just can't fulfill the requirements of the job. So even there's limitations on the idea that you can't discriminate against people based upon things like their disability or quote-unquote gender. Now, it's not specifically because they're a woman, of course, but it's because they can't handle the weight there. But I think the point Senator Herron is making, besides the assumption she's making that LGBTQ is a protected class, but the line she says in there about balancing of civil rights with religious beliefs is pretty scary when you start to think about it. Because, of course, we have a spelled out right to religious freedom in the Constitution. Civil rights, while they're laws, civil rights do not have, per se, a constitutional basis. In fact, parts of civil rights laws, as I said, the freedom of association, kind of go against parts of the Constitution, for an example. And so when you talk about, I need to balance your actual constitutional right versus a law, that is ignoring the fact that the Constitution is the law of the land. The Constitution supersedes all other laws. She's ignoring that. Well, coming back after this, we'll dig into what some other people had to say after this, other Democrats had to say after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before the break, we were talking about Senate Bill 60, a bill protecting religious freedoms in Kentucky. Of course, the Democrats threw a fit about it because anything that's at all pro-Christian or kind of sounds pro-Christian or pro-religion at all, really, they take big issues with, of course. So, of course, they're going to throw a fit about it. And we already covered what one of them said. We covered, of course, what the bill's sponsor, Senator Rawlings, had to say about the bill. Now let's hear what some other Democrats had to say. And I'm going to turn now to our old favorite, Senator Berg out of Louisville. Always good for the worst possible take on an issue. Let's listen to what she had to say here.
Literally Christian nationalists coming into our state with their national bills, okay? But it doesn't have to do with my question. My question is this. I have stood now, this is my 5th session on the floor as a Kentucky state senator. I have always thought there was a separation of church and state. But still, to this day, we seem to open our government business in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Will I have a cause of action to sue under this bill?
Of course, everybody's a Christian nationalist. I love how she leads off with that, like, oh, by the way, they're out-of-state Christians talking about this bill. Sure, it was sponsored by people in state. Sure, it's supported by people in state. But the people who came and were experts on it asked to speak, well, they're Christians from out of state. We need to worry about them Christians coming into our state. But outside of that, she does bring up the old adage line about separation of church and state, which, by the way, for those of you who are unaware, that isn't actually in our Constitution, by the way. It's a dogma that comes from the Federalist Papers. And even when it's in the Federalist Papers, what they're talking about is that everyone should get equal treatment under the law, regardless of their religion, and there shouldn't be a religious test to get into office. So you shouldn't have to be a Christian in order to hold an elected office. Like, there shouldn't be like, okay, here's your requirements to run for office. You have to be at least 30 years old, live in the district, and a Christian. That was what they were arguing about. That's what they're saying you can't have as a requirement. Basically, in enforcing a government-enforced religion that we are quote-unquote forcing on others. It's not about whether or not you can open up in prayer, because what she said at the end was she is claiming that under this bill, if it passed, would she have the ability for a cause of action on behalf of her constituents because they open up every day of session with prayer of some sort. It's not even always Christian. Sometimes it's they bring in a rabbi or somebody else to issue a prayer to start off the session. It's well established that just because government offers some sort of moment of religion, such as when you stand up and say the pledge at school and say one nation under God, that is offered. However, as long as they're not forcing you to take part in the prayer or forcing you to say the pledge or forcing you to practice another religion, well, you're not violating their religious rights just because somebody else in the room is practicing their religion, of course. But I want to get to the worst person here with the worst argument, and that would be Senator Thomas out of Fayette County. This one's a little bit longer. It's 4 minutes long. Let's go ahead and take a listen to it. I want to make sure you hear everything, and we'll discuss it afterwards.
You could have a nonprofit employer who advertises for a position. And you could have someone who's a member of that LGBTQ plus community who's qualified, seek to apply for it. And during the course of the interview, it could come out that that person was gay or lesbian or transgender, whatever. And the employer could say, well, I can't hire you. I don't hire those type of people. That's not good for my business. And because this bill prohibits the application of all local or state laws, policies of city, county governments, then if a member of the local government sought to enforce that fairness ordinance, then as the senator from Boone 11 has indicated, that person could be sued. We include in this Senate Bill 60 a private right of action. But here's the real kicker to the members of the public. It goes even further than that. We have something called immunity for public officials who act. We say if you act and you're trying to act in the best government interest, you're immune from suit. But this bill does something that you just don't see in law. This bill says that for purposes of this provision, this bill, we eliminate sovereign governmental immunity. So that means if you're a police officer or a member of the government, an official, and you're trying to enforce a fairness ordinance, then you could be personally liable for that and lose your home and car and all your bank assets. We don't give those government officials immunity, even though that's standard law here in America. So that's what this bill is designed to do. It's designed to wipe out all fairness ordinances and expose members of the LGBTQ community, again, to second-class citizenship. Now, this is the second time we've done this in this session. We just did it a little over a week ago with Senate Bill 2. And why we want to continue to vilify those individuals who've done nothing wrong, who've done nothing to harm us, just confounds me. So for all of those reasons, because I don't think any law should be discriminatory in its nature, and I think the question that the senator from Jefferson 26 was getting to was right. This bill is designed to encourage discrimination. And I've said in the committee, I'm all for religious freedom. I just voted this week to approve a moment of silence. I think when religion is being used as a shield, as protection, to allow people to engage in the free exercise of their religion, comes directly from the First Amendment, to engage in the free exercise of religion, that is fine, and that should always be a cornerstone of our Constitution. But when religion is being used as a sword to rip apart our society, I will always say no.
So he starts off, by the way, his example, for those of you who missed it, was he didn't say a for-profit business, he didn't say a store, he said specifically a non-profit business. Now, why would he say a non-profit business? Because, of course, churches are non-profits. That's why. And it's very reasonable here that like a church daycare may want to say, look, I don't want somebody who's transgender or cross-dressing, a male cross-dressing as a female in front of these kids, because according to our religion, we're at church, by the way, at a daycare, According to our religion, we view that as a sin, and naturally, the parents don't want their kids around that. Now, you may disagree and say, I don't think that's a sin, and that's your prerogative. That's what freedom of religion means. However, what it also means is these individuals will look at that and say, look, I don't want somebody who we view as actively sinning. And that's something people don't understand, I think, is missed in it. You know, everybody sins. We all fall short of the glory of God. However, it's something different to glorify sin. It's something different to be actively sinning in front of children and then being viewed as a place of authority or a role model or somehow what you're doing is okay. And by putting your kids in front of somebody who's actively sinning and putting them in a position of authority, i.e. a daycare teacher, you're now telling your child that this is okay. That's the religious problem they have. And it's very reasonable that a business may look at that and say, I feel uncomfortable with that. But it's what at the end that bothers me, especially with what he said. See, the sender said, and I'm quoting here, he said, when religion is being used as a sword to rip apart our society, I'll always say no. This is exactly why the bill is needed, and exactly why there needs to be a waiver of immunity, by the way. What he's talking about there is what he believes. If he believes your religious freedom is somehow damaging his idea of a utopia, his idea of a good society, well then those rights should be taken away from you and should be inflicted upon you. And it is no way a person's position to use government to enforce their belief that your religious beliefs are somehow a problem in society. Therefore, they will use the powers of government to force you out of them. That's why this bill is needed. Well, coming up after this, we'll be digging into Democrats said something else dumb, and then also, let's talk about movies. Let's talk about why we're shelling out tens of millions a year in economic incentives for the movie business here in Kentucky. We'll have that after this short break. And you're back here on this final segment of the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So I gave you an example last two segments talking about Senate Bill 60, where the Democrats just, if it's inconvenient to them, they just want to ignore that part of the Constitution. Here's another part here. This past week, the REINS Act passed in the House, and it's to overhaul, rein in the federal government, the state's government's ability to pass administrative regulations. And so the legislature goes ahead and passes the REINS Act out of the House, and in doing so, there was that one part where T.J. Roberts decided to go ahead and talk on the bill, and the Kentucky Democrats shared out this clip of the video.
Truly, the lawmaking branch is the most powerful branch of government.
So what the Democrats said about that was, they said the extremist @real T.J. Roberts wants to dangerously upend our constitutional system of checks and balances by giving the legislature dominance over the executive and judicial branch. That's not how our democracy works. The Constitution established 3 equal branches for a reason. The Democrats apparently missed this part of civics class because you are a fool if you believe that our Constitution, both federally and in this state, was drafted to create 3 co-equal branches of government. Because that is frankly false. That was not in our Constitution. The legislative branch can impeach and remove any member of the executive branch, both in Kentucky and federal. The legislative branch can impeach and remove any member of the judiciary, both in the state and at the federal level. Additionally, the legislative branch can defund either of those branches if they so choose to do so. So I would say the person who says how much money you can spend and who can fire you, that branch, because the executive and the judiciary have no ability to remove a legislator. But absolutely, legislators have the ability to remove the other 2. So the fact that this branch, the legislative branch, what our founders called the people's branch, can control the money you spend and remove you from office, but you can't do the same to them, tells you that the legislative branch is clearly the most powerful branch. It literally creates the rules the other 2 branches have to follow outside of the constitutions, state and federal. And I guess the Democrats just they just type this out. Let me just type this out. Before I even think about it, they decide to do so. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, here's just one. This decision came just a few years ago. And what they said here was, as we've noted time and time again, so many times that we need not provide a citation, the General Assembly establishes the public policy of the Commonwealth. That was a unanimous decision from the Kentucky Supreme Court in Cameron v. Beshear in 2021. Unanimously, they all agreed that clearly, and they said, we've said this so many times, we're not even going to bother citing this anymore. Clearly, the legislature is the most powerful branch. Just, once again, Democrats lose their mind. Okay, let's talk about movies. Movies sound great, right? Well, for some reason this year, our legislature has decided they want to go all in on the movies. It's an important industry to them now. Suddenly, they want to put the feathers in the cap. Say, I got that movie here. I guess they feel more accomplished if they can see something up there on the big screen that they feel like they had a part of. Maybe they might even get their own IMDb pages. Cross your fingers. I have one. I've been in a documentary. I have an IMDb page. They want one too, but for this time, they want it for going ahead and shelling your money out to theater kids. Let me tell you, let me explain what's going on here. So, legislators all around the nation have always been pushing hard to get movies filmed in their states. It just makes them feel special. It's a badge of honor, right? And in order to justify the tens of millions of dollars they hand out in incentive packages to get these movies into their states, they want to talk about how many jobs it creates. Now, anybody who's halfway intelligent knows that the movie industry creates pretty much temporary jobs, right? I mean, they come in, they shoot, they may hire locally, they may bring people in from out of state. Those jobs exist for the length of the production, and then they go away. Now, there are some, like if you're an editing company and you're just constantly busy, you work full-time, or if you're, I don't know, staff at a show or another production, you may work full-time on that. But generally speaking, these are pieceworks. You're working on one film or TV show, you're working on another film and TV show, and that's just how it works. And sometimes they bring in people and sometimes they don't. And but regardless, they do want to talk about how many jobs it brings in, because that's kind of their justification. But what are we paying out for these jobs? Like, realistically, is this actually a good investment? Well, let's see where we are now, right? So right now, the state every year hands out $75 million in economic incentive. It's called the Entertainment Incentive Program. It started in 2009. And they hand these out as tax breaks to places, to films and production crews to come into Kentucky. And let me tell you some of these tax breaks and what we've given them to. So, 1,000 Pound Sisters, season 4, 5, and 6. For every season, for season 4, they received $828,000. Season 5, $666,000. And season 6, $816,000. That is over $2 million in economic incentives to film seasons 4, 5, and 6 of 1,000 Pound Sisters in Kentucky. Now, does that paint Kentucky as a particularly great state? Do you think that helps our image at all? I mean, the show's fine and all, but do we really need to be incentivizing them to come in and make Kentucky look bad? We also have, here's this, over $3.3 million each for Sassy Maids, Sassy Maids 2, and Sassy Maids 3. They also approved $108,000 to Swingertown Movie, LLC, to create a movie called Lethal Desires. Also, The Thruple from Hell, $187,000. The thruple, as in a three-person relationship. Fantastic. I'm sure that is really pushing forward Kentucky values. Good use of money. So we have that already going on, but to throw more on top of that, we now see Senate Bill 1 moving through the legislation. What Senate Bill 1 will create now an entire film economic development cabinet off of the economic development cabinet, and a whole department dedicated to bringing in movies, the film department, which will have, of course, a director paid well over 6 figures, I imagine, to get more movies to be shot here in Kentucky. And of course, they will also have a whole lot of extra bucks at their disposal on top of the $75 million in order to bring these movies in. Now you say, well, that's just all, but it isn't. Now we switch over to Louisville, where the General Assembly is given $10 million to a building in Louisville, the Gardens it's called, being turned into a sound stage for films to be shot at. On top of the $10 million, of course, the company operating and doing the venue is getting that building for a cost of $1 a year. The building, the city of Louisville purchased for adjusted for inflation, $430,000. Well, it was $430,000 back in the day. It's like up over $500,000 now, adjusted for inflation. And then they also gave about $1.2 million to another group to already do renovations in the place. So all in all, we're about like $12 million in the hole. And in return for this, they said they're building a sound stage that will bring a massive 50 full-time jobs and help encourage movies into the area. 50 full-time jobs, that's $200,000 a job that we're paying. Now, of course, we're going to hand out other economic incentives to the people coming in. So that bears the question of, when do we get our $10 million back? What is our return on investment if that's something you think government should be doing? When will that happen? Well, Greenberg gives us some idea. He says, look, films are already filming in Louisville. This isn't a build it, they will come. He says they're already doing $150 million a year in investments in the film industry. Now, of course, he doesn't go into if that's the production budget or the marketing budget, plus the production. And of course, we're ignoring the fact that, production around the Kentucky Derby and horse racing, that regardless if we offered economic incentives or not, would take place in Kentucky because, well, it's a sporting event. It's covered. It's a nationally watched event. You don't need to add incentives for them to do that. So what are the chances we make our money back? $75 million a year, bust down our 12. Now we're going to probably add in our $25 million through the Economic Development Cabinet, thrown at them, $100 million a year. We're currently, Greenberg said we're doing $150 million right now. Let's say you double it. Let's say you triple it. $100 million a year to bring in $300 million in budget, which we don't even know if that's still just the marketing or production budget. Seems like a big waste to me, but I guess whatever they need to do to get that feather in the cap. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooper Show. I thank y'all so much for joining me. We'll be back here later this week. I hope you have a great rest of your day.